we offer ourselves now in your presence. In Jesus' name we have come. Amen. Let's be seated.
Well, last week, I wanted to introduce you to somebody, and my step-grandson from Norway is here, Oliver, and I wanted you to meet him. Oliver, wave at everybody. It's okay, he speaks English. Yeah, you can take it. It's been so good to meet him and get to know him, and he came at a very difficult time, as most of you know. If you were here last week, about 20 minutes before the first service, I got the phone call. And at the time, I did not know that my grandson had passed, and so I was really struggling with what I should do. And thankfully, two people talked some sense into me, and I left. And as you know, and I appreciate what Tim did, and I appreciate your prayers. We have felt them all this week. Thank you for the meals. Thank you for the emails, the texts. We couldn't answer all of them, of course, but we read every single one of them. So thank you so much, and I hope that you'll continue to pray for my daughter Hannah and my son-in-law Eric, and both of our families. And you may ask, how are you doing this, Pastor? Well, I just have to tell you that you need to know about the hope that we have, and so I have to get up here and share that with you. We could not do this without the hope that we have in the resurrected Christ, as we've sung about today. So I just had to get back in the saddle and share with you today. So thank you again, and keep us in your prayers in the future as we still go through this. We've been studying the life of David, and when I drove to the hospital last Sunday and found out he had already passed, and we went in to see Kai for the last time before we had to leave the hospital, I gathered around my family and prayed, and I said, God, I know now how David felt. Because David lost a son, an infant, and while he was alive, he was sick, but he was praying for him. He mourned. He had sackcloth and ashes, which was their custom, and he wouldn't eat. Just prayed, mourned, and then when he passed away, the Bible says that David got up, cleaned himself off, he ate, and when his servants around him said, "How can you do this?" He said, "Because he can no longer come to me, but I can go to him." And that was the promise that we clung to as we prayed that prayer. And I told Eric, I said, Eric, we'll see him again, and I'll see him before you will. So don't worry about it. So in studying the life of David, I think we just need to just a little bit of review. We've been looking at the ups and downs of David, and he's very much like us. We go through these things in life, these ups and downs. And, you know, one minute he's slaying a giant with the power of God, and then the next minute, he's making really dumb decisions that affect people and affect people's lives. In fact, they took people's lives, cost them their lives. And then the last time I was up, you know, we saw David make a good choice, a good decision, because he paid attention to the tension that he felt when he was considering a bad choice. And that's kind of where we left David. He's still not king yet. He's still a fugitive on the run. And today, as we look at his story, we're going to pick up right where we left off. And we're going to get there, but before we get there, there's this thing called the Golden Rule. We all are very familiar with it. And do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We're raised with it. Our parents tried to beat it into us. Some of you may not have known that it was biblical, but it is biblical. And so this is just something that we have lived with. It's a great rule, isn't it? And that's all fine and good until somebody does mistreat us. And when that happens, we try to rewrite that rule. And it becomes the golden rule-ish. And we kind of rewrite it to where it looks like this: do unto others as others have done unto you. Because when we get mistreated, what is the first thing we think about? You know, we get mad when somebody cuts you off in traffic. What do you want to do? You know, I'll be honest. You want to cut them off or you want to flip them off? What do you just, that's what we do, isn't it? It's that reaction that we have. And so we kind of rewrite the rule. We want to do unto them like they have done unto us. But then there's this other thing that happens, and you can't see it in the mirror, but other people see it if you are like this. And that's when someone mistreats you and you can't mistreat them back, then you go and mistreat somebody else. And we rewrite the rule again, and it looks like this: do unto others as someone else has done unto you. And maybe you have been the recipient of that, where someone's gone through something that they've been mistreated on, and they're taking it out on you. And so we kind of look at that golden rule, and we try to change it up sometimes according to our circumstances. And believe it or not, it has everything to do with what we're talking about today. Because today we're going to find David on the verge of making another bad decision. But at the very last minute, I mean the very last minute, a woman shows up and rescues him. Now, how many times, guys, have we at the last minute been saved by a woman, right? And we're grateful for that, aren't we? So as we get into that, here's the main idea of what we're going to be talking about today. The problem with getting back at someone, or to use the vernacular that we use, getting even with someone, the problem with it is it makes you basically even with them. Why would we want to do that? It only makes you even with someone that you consider yourself ahead of. Why would you want to get ahead of someone that you don't even like? Why would you want to be even with them? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today in this story. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 25. It's kind of just going through this chronologically. And David is still a fugitive in the wilderness. He's surrounded by his merry men. He's living off the land, trying to stay out of trouble, trying to stay away from the Philistines. But at the same time, he's not feeling welcome in his own country. And as we read this, just like a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, the verses, it just takes a long time to tell the story and read the story. And I mean, if we just started reading, it would take us 30 minutes just to read everything about this story. So I'm going to have to kind of go through this and show you what's going on, share a little bit about what's happening, and then at the end, I'm going to take you to the notes that you have so you can fill in some blanks. And we're going to be looking at some responses from different characters. But before we begin, I just want to pray and ask God to show us what he wants us to know about this subject of getting even with someone. So would you pray with me? Father, thank you so much for this story we're about to read, because it really is where all of us are at one point in our lives. And for some, they are there at that point right now where we have been mistreated by someone. And the temptation is to get back. But help us to realize today, Father, that that's only making us like them. Show us what you want us to do through this story. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're going to read through this story. We're going to begin in verse 2. And I'll kind of explain things as we go along. It says, a certain man in Moan, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. Now, what that says in ancient times, basically, is this guy was super wealthy. He was very wealthy. Verse 3, his name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings, and he was a Calebite. In other words, he was very heavy, he was harsh, and he was a pain. Nobody liked him. In fact, his name, as we'll learn later, actually means, Nabal means fool, and we'll find out later that he lived up to his name. But the story continues in verse 4. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Now, let me just stop and say something about shearing sheep real quick. In this season, when herdsmen are people who had sheep or had a lot of flocks, when they sheared their sheep, this was like an annual paycheck. Every year they would gather, and it would be a party, it would be a festive banquet time. And so it was like an annual financial statement. And this is when the person who had the sheep found out how wealthy they really were. And Nabal is about to find out that he has been wealthier than he thought. So he's got a good bonus coming in. So this is generally a very festive time. The owner is feeling generous. The owner is feeling wealthy. And they come to the end of the season, and basically everybody's going to get a big paycheck. It's bonus time. So in verse 6, David says to his men, I want you to tell Nabal this. He says, say to him, long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. And when your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. So essentially what David was saying through his messengers that he sent was basically, Nabal, if you have a prophet, part of the reason you have a prophet is due to the protection of my men throughout the whole time. Because our men were in the wilderness right next to where you were watching sheep. And at any point, we could have stolen from you, but we protected you. And consequently, there's this sense in which we protected your shepherds and we didn't steal anything. And so this is why he says this, ask your own servants, they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. So are you following this? He's saying, since we were good to you, Nabal, would you be good to us? Since we were kind to you, would you be kind to us? Since we didn't steal from you, would you be willing to share with us? Knowing that the whole time, during this whole season, my men, David would say, could have taken anything they wanted, anytime they wanted, and there would be nothing you could do about it. But we chose not to. So in verse 9, when David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants. Look at what he says. Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. In other words, I know who you're talking about. I know who sent you, this David guy. He's a rogue. He's a fugitive. He's an outlaw. He's out of favor with the king. And besides that, I didn't ask for his help. So I don't owe him anything. I don't owe you anything. So in verse 11, he says, why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? So verse 12 says, David's men turned around and went back. And when they arrived, they reported every word. And David said to his men, each of you strap on your sword. So they did, and David strapped his on as well. And this is where I stop and look at David and say, oh, here we go again. You're about to take matters into your own hands. Have you not learned your lesson? Now, evidently, his patience is probably worn out. That's part of it. If you kind of read between the lines now, he's been on the run now for several years. He's having to live off the land. And when he should be living at home or even in the palace, because Saul was his father-in-law technically. And maybe even be the king by now. Who knows? But he's tried to do the right thing. And when he did the wrong thing, he always repented. And he's trying not to side with the enemies of Israel, but at the same time, Israel won't embrace him as a son. It won't embrace him as the hero that he is. And he's just tired. He's worn out. And in some way, maybe this was the last straw for him. And as we mentioned earlier, this may be a case where his frustration is being telegraphed to someone else. He's been mistreated, so he's going to mistreat someone else because he can't get back at who mistreated him. But there's so much pent-up stuff, and this is the last straw. And he says, guys, strap on your sword. We're going to go take care of business. Now, in our world, you've heard this before, hurt people hurt people. You ever heard that? Hurt people hurt people. Perhaps this is an example of hunted people hunt people. David's being hunted by King Saul and King Saul's army, and now David's going to go hunt somebody that he feels has been unkind or unfair to him. And the cool thing is, we find this out a little bit later on as we read it. But as David straps on his sword and he gets ready and begins this journey to Nabal to pay him back, he starts talking to himself. And you and I do this too, because when we're trying to get even with somebody, we try to justify it by talking to ourselves. And, saying, he did this to me. I have every right to do this to him or her. And we talk to ourselves, and in just a minute in the text, we're going to actually get insight into what David says. But as we read on, it says about 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields, near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Well, Abigail didn't waste any time. Verse 18, it says, Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. And then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. Now I want you to just picture this in your mind. There's this ravine. David and his men are snaking their way down into this ravine. It's a fertile valley where they're shearing the sheep. Probably could see the fires from the camp, the smoke from the campfires as they were doing all this shearing. And she sees David's snake of men coming down this ravine, and he's all armored up. They've got their weapons, and they're headed towards her village where all of this is taking place. And the cool thing, and this is where the story tells us that what David's thinking. Because he's had this long journey. He's building up a head of steam. He's about to butcher some innocent people that he's never met. And he's about to loose this rage that's been building up in him. And here's what the text says in verse 21. David had just said, so he's either thinking to himself or maybe even said it out loud, it's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. So this is what he's been telling himself. He's justifying his actions. Now this next part, it is so rich. And I'm going to walk you through it slowly, because this is the kind of thing that if you just read this, you'll miss a lot. But it's so rich, so follow me. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. Now this is very strange. She is the wife of a wealthy man. David is an outlaw, a fugitive. He's a rogue, a very dangerous person to even be associated with. And it's just a matter of time before King Saul finds him, executes him, and his name will never be spoken again. But here's this very wealthy woman married to this very influential person, and she bows down to David. And this totally catches David off guard. And then she begins what she begins to do is she begins to treat David as if he is already the man that she hopes that he will be. She begins to treat him as if he has already become the man that she hopes he will become. Now, ladies, you need to take note of this, okay? This works on us even when we know what you're doing. Okay? I'm serious. You can just tell us, okay? You do that thing where you make him feel better about himself than he should. And I'm telling for you, we fall for it every time. It's like you're patting us on the head. You know, it's like, you are so strong. I bet you could take out those garbage cans with one arm. And we thought, oh, yeah, you want to watch? Here. And that's what we do. And we know you're doing it, but it's in us. It's just in us. And so Abigail, she's so smart. And this is so powerful. And I'm not talking about manipulating. This is just a dynamic. And I'm telling you, she saved the day. She begins to speak to David's potential. And she begins to look past what he's about to do. And she speaks to his future. And it is so, so powerful. And we get all this detail. Look what happened. Verse 24. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my Lord. Let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say." Now, she's not his servant. She's just being subservient. And again, I'm not saying there's a one-to-one correlation here, ladies, so please don't go say, well, Bobby told us we're supposed to bow down. No. That's not what I'm saying. This is a culture where this made sense. And our culture would just be weird. But there has to be a parallel somewhere, right? In our culture. She says, "Please pay no attention, my Lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent. And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my Lord, be given to the men who follow you." And then she gives him credit for being a better man than he actually is. This is so powerful. She says, "Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live." She speaks to David's future. David, God is up to something great in you. God has a plan for your life. God has a future for you, and here's why. Because you fight the Lord's battles. And there's no wrongdoing found in you as long as you live. You're not a wrongdoer. You're a good man. And then she says this, "Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God." Now again, you read that and you don't really see what that means. And I had to dig a little bit deeper here to see what she was saying. And it's so powerful because the language that she uses when she says wrapped securely or bound securely in the bundle, it's the language that's used for a wallet or a purse. And it's where you take something valuable, generally money or coins, and you would put them in this wallet or purse, and you would wrap the strings around them tightly, and then you would tuck it in your belt to make sure it's secure. So essentially, here's what she's saying, and again, the imagery is so powerful. She says, look, even though somebody is trying to steal your life, like a thief would steal a coin, even though someone is trying to steal your life is safely tucked away in God's wallet. Your life is buried in the bottom of a woman's purse. Beautiful imagery. Now, let me just say something about that real quick. Men, have you ever tried to find something in the bottom of your wife's purse? It's scary, isn't it? When you're asking where something is, well, go look in my purse. I'm like, you freeze. Who wants to go in the bottom of that purse? That's how safe it is. Your life is buried in the bottom of a purse. Your life is buried in God's wallet. And then she does something. She takes David back to the moment that when he was 15 years old, facing Goliath. And here she uses this imagery. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. And it's like, now he's back in the moment when it's all about the sling and the slingshot. And he's back in that moment when he was completely dependent on God, when he wasn't having to take matters into his own hands. And now she speaks to his future. And essentially in this next section, and again, this is so powerful, and for some of you, this is going to be the point of the whole message. In this next section, she essentially asks, without asking, this powerful question. David, what story do you want to tell when this is nothing but a story that you're eventually going to tell? David, when you're looking back at this incident, and there's nothing but a story that you tell, what story do you want to tell about this moment in time? And here's what she says. Verse 30, when the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And I just have to think that right now David he's melting. And she goes on, and he's just saying, melting, and she says, David, one day this is nothing but a story that you tell, and what you do in this moment is going to be a permanent part of the story. And I believe you're going to change your mind because you don't want to tell a story of needless bloodshed, do you? And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. And suddenly David comes to his senses, and his emotional temperature begins to drop. And he sees things in a brand new way. In verse 32, David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day, from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. And then David accepted from her hand what she brought him and said, go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. And Abigail is so smart. And look what happens next. You know what happens next? It's amazing. You want to know what happens next? I just want to make sure. When Abigail, verse 36, went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He had just discovered he was very wealthy. And he was in high spirits and very drunk, and so she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. And they lived happily ever after. The end. Great story, isn't it? Now, I made up the last part, of course, that they lived happily ever after. That's not in there, but the rest of it is. And just to make sure we put this in proper perspective, she became one of David's wives. And nobody lives happily ever after when you're one of several wives, okay? But I'll let you read that on your own later. But in summary, here's what we have, all right? We have three characters. We have three responses. And this is where I want you to go to your notes and write some things down that I want you to remember. First, we have Nabal. What does Nabal do? He gives evil for good. David protected his flock, protected his shepherds. He didn't ask him to. They could have stolen what they wanted, but they didn't. David asked, can you share a little bit of the wealth with us since we helped you out? Nabal says no. So he returned evil for good. But then you have David. David was about to return evil for evil. Now, that makes sense, especially in the day in which they live, but Abigail sees things in a completely different way, and through her lens and through her unique perspective, she returns good for evil. 3 characters, 3 responses, but only one hero. Now again, you have Nabal, maniacal. Nobody wants to be like him. But then you have David, he's predictable. And he's predictable because that's what we do when someone mistreats us. We want to get back at them. Here's the deal. During this time in history, the nation of Israel was in a covenant with God. We call it the Old Covenant. And it's contained in the Old Testament. Old Covenant, Old Testament. And in the Old Covenant, returning evil for evil was actually okay. It was an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You read the Old Testament law, you see David's response, and we think it's a little barbaric and a bit over the top. But if you see the response of his men when he said, guys, strap on your swords, we're going to go take care of business, they're not overacting, and they're not saying to David, look, are you going a little too far here? They're like, heck yeah, let's go have some fun, let's get the swords on. That was just the world they lived in. But Abigail, she's way ahead of her time, because the new covenant, the New Testament, that's where Jesus showed up. And he turned all of that upside down. In fact, here's something really cool. Peter, the Apostle Peter, he saw Jesus unjustly arrested. He saw Jesus unjustly crucified. And Peter, who saw Jesus, who was innocent, sinless, treated so horribly, he saw Jesus' response. And he's writing to Christians who are being mistreated in the first century. And he doesn't go all David on us. He goes Jesus on us. He goes Abigail on us. And here's what he does. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, here's what he says. Do not repay evil with evil, or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. In other words, whenever you're mistreated, you don't just ignore it. You don't go neutral. You go positive. You go blessing. This is what Peter taught. This is what Abigail did. And this is the unusual thing. Repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called. In other words, you're a Christian, Peter says. This is what we're called to. We knew we were going to be mistreated. We saw them crucify our leader. What did you expect? How do you expect to be treated? And in the next few verses, he actually quotes David from Psalm 34. Look at what David said. See, David learned this later on. He wrote about it. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So David learned not to return evil for evil, but to return good for evil. So in closing, 3 questions. And I want you to write these down. 2 are for everybody, but one of them is specifically for those of us who call ourselves Christ followers. And here's the first question. We'll wrap this up. Do I really want to be even with someone I don't even like? I mean, you don't, right? To get even with someone you don't like is to be like that person. Why would you do that? Why would I do that? Why act like the person you don't like? Wouldn't it be better, instead of being even, to be ahead? And do you know how you pull ahead? You pull ahead by refusing to get even. Second question, and this is a big one, but it's the same one Abigail asked without asking. What story do you want to tell? You go back to the life of David. He's sitting on his mule, perhaps can see the smoke from the campfires where they're shearing sheep. He's a few hundred yards away from a totally different kind of story. And Abigail stops him and speaks to his future. Do you really want this on your conscience, David? Is this the story you want to tell? How did you become king? Well, I went around slaughtering innocent people, and finally they were so scared of me they made me king. Is that really the story you want to tell? And this is the question we should all ask at every juncture of life, because every event in your life is just a story that you will tell later. How do you want that story to look? When you're mistreated, what story do you want to tell? Oh, I got back at him really good. Is that the story you want to tell? Do you really want your story to be, I got even? See, that's predictable, but so unremarkable. Because Nabal, maniacal, David, predictable, Abigail, very remarkable. And then there's this third question, and this is one where everybody can play, but this is specifically for Christians. What would it look like for you or for me to return good for evil? As you think about him, or as you think about her, or as you think about your ex, or as you think about your ex-employer, or your workmate that works next to you that mistreated you, or as you think about that son or daughter who mistreated you, or your parents who mistreated you, or your dad that didn't do things right, when you think about those things in that specific context, in that specific relationship, what would it look like to return good for evil, to use Peter's word? What would it look like for you to be a blessing to someone who's hurt you or offended you? Not do nothing, but to be proactive and actually do something. You see, if you do nothing, that's mercy. I'm not going to give you what you deserve. But if you actually do something, that's grace. And isn't that where our story intersects with his? Because he returned good for evil. When we were in our sin, he returned good for evil, died on the cross for us. That's grace. What would it look like? Let me show you what it looked like for me one time. And I'm not good all the time, believe me, but this one time I did well. I was going to Whataburger one day for lunch. I was by myself. And I was driving through the parking lot, and I saw this guy getting out of his car, and he was walking. He had parked on the other side of where the restaurant was, so he was going to have to walk through the driving through part to get to where he was going. So I saw him, and he was about halfway across, and I kept going, but I stopped. But evidently, I didn't stop soon enough for him. Okay? So I probably stopped about 10 feet from him. But he didn't like it. And I'm not a very good lip reader, but I could pretty much tell what he was saying, you know. And he really was angry. I even heard him yelling at me as he crossed over. And so I went and parked, and I went in to put my order in. And it was lunchtime, so it was a fairly long line. Well, guess who I end up behind in this line? It's this guy. And he's still steaming. He's mad. He's cursing under his breath. And then he looks at me and said, "Didn't you see me?" I said, Yeah, I saw you. You're here, aren't you? I saw you. And, I just tried to, just brush it off, but he just wouldn't have anything to do with it. He said, you watch where you're going, blah, blah, blah. I said, no, I'm sorry. Well, he just wouldn't let it go. Well, when we finally got up to the line, he was putting his order in, and I just felt prompted to do this, to return good for evil. So I went up behind him, and when they gave him the total, I said, this man's lunch is on me. And it totally caught him off guard. And he just looked at me and said, no, I said, this is on me, bud. I'm sorry that you feel like you do. I'm going to take care of this. Now, he totally changed. He was a different person from that moment on. But that's what happens when we give grace instead of mercy. I wish I could say I do that all the time, but I don't, just like you. But we should. Because as Christians, that's what we're called to do, to give grace. So I want to encourage you today to do what we talked about. Do you really want to get even with someone you don't even like? Just go back to that main idea we talked about from the very beginning. It doesn't help. Getting even only makes you even with someone you don't like. Do more. Be positive. Be a blessing. And give grace. Would you pray with me? Every head bowed, every eye closed. And maybe right now, as we've talked about this, something has come to your mind of someone who has mistreated you. And you really are thinking about getting back at them, trying to figure out how you should do it. You talk to yourself and you justify it. Would you just allow God to show you today that that's not the way it's done? Don't go Nabal. Don't go David. Go Abigail. Go Jesus. Go positive. I'll let God deal with you on that today and ask him to show you what you need to do, what it looks like for you to return good for evil. Father, as we leave this place today, I pray that you have spoken to our hearts. Thank you for Abigail, who went beyond just being neutral, but she went positive and she returned blessing for evil. Show us how to do that, Father, because when we are doing that, we're never more like you, our Heavenly Father, by giving grace. So show us what that looks like and enable us to live it this week as soon as we leave this place. We ask this in Jesus' name.